For today's AM Minnesota program, my guest, Tom Hoverstad, who's a scientist at the Southern Research and Outreach Center at Waseca. Tom, thanks for jumping on the program at the last minute, but I wanted to talk to somebody who knew a little bit about planting corn. Given the weather, some of us are getting a little frustrated.
Yep, it's a little concerning. The one thing we have now that we didn't have a lot of years ago is a pretty good weather forecast, and that spring 3 to 5 day outlook is pretty accurate, and looks like we're going to get into some cold, rainy conditions here, and that has some people concerned.
Well, up until 2 or 3 years ago, I had never heard about cold inhibition injury, cold shocking the seed. I don't think most other farmers had either. And all at once we started hearing about it. And Tom, I got hurt here 3 years ago. I planted corn on a Saturday. It was 75 or 80 degrees, beautiful day. But the next day it was supposed to get really cold with rain. And those few acres I planted just to get the tweaks out and make sure the planter was working fine, it really hurt my population or my stand.
Yes, it's cold water imbibition. First, let's talk about soil temperatures. A lot of people call and say, what's the soil temperature? And my answer is usually, well, what's the air temperature? At the zone we're seeding corn, it's usually not a lot different. There's kind of historically been a perception that the soil warms up in the spring, magically one day hits 50 and never goes back down, but that's really not the case, especially at the seeding zone. Maybe at like 3 to 4 feet, our temperatures do that, kind of have a yearly variation where they warm in the spring, they get warm in the summer, and they cool off in the winter, but that's at very deep depths. Maybe affects things like trees, not much of our corn or our garden vegetables. So soil temperature does go up and down. We've been above normal the last few days. Our soil temperatures have reached into the 60s at the seeding zone. Even this morning, our low was probably about 55. So soil temperature at this point in time is not a concern for planting corn. The forecast is what has people concerned. And there's been a term thrown around the last few years, cold water imbibition, or imbibitional chilling. And
let's keep it simple. Let's just call it cold shock.
Cold shock. And I'd even keep it simpler. I think it even goes into seedling vigor. We know that corn now certainly has much better seedling vigor than it did years ago, and is much more cold tolerant. We get away with planting corn a lot earlier now than we used to years ago. If you took a hybrid from the 1960s or 70s and planted it today, you would likely be in trouble. Now, most of our modern genetics, and it isn't that if you plant corn today, it's going to be a problem. A lot of them can, but there's certain conditions, and I think they're very easy to document in a controlled laboratory type condition where they can set the temperature exactly where they want it and demonstrate these things, but I think it's very hard to duplicate in the field. So I think there's people, like you said, you planted on a Saturday, it was cold and damp following that, you had a problem. There's probably some people that didn't have that same problem. It's very hard to really duplicate what they're talking about in the laboratory conditions.
Well, Tom, if you can stand by, we have to hit the marker break. Right after that, we'll talk more about cold shocking a seed and getting this corn planted. I think my guest on today's AM Minnesota program is Tom Hoverstad, who's a scientist at the Southern Research and Outreach Center at Waseca. Just before the marker break, Tom and I were discussing the planting conditions, the concern some farmers have that maybe their fields are dry enough to get going with planting corn. They're concerned about the weather forecast, really cold temperatures and some rain in the next day or two. And my sense is, Tom, you were kind of leading us to the fact that if your soil conditions are fit, maybe you should be planting corn.
I think that's true in most cases. You know, we mentioned imbibitional chilling or cold water imbibition. like you said, cold shock. I think a lot of terms for that. Most corn has pretty good cold tolerance now. But let's just kind of talk a little bit about this imbibitional chilling, that term that gets thrown around, and I think a lot of agronomists use that to explain some issues that happen. I don't know that it's any different than what we've seen other years. And here's what happens when you plant corn. First thing it does is imbibition. That just means taking on fluid. In the case of corn seeds in the ground, it's soil water, and that's the first thing that happens. And then cells start to grow, elongate. You'll see a radicle. The first root is the first thing that comes out. Then that white little mesocotyl pushes the coleoptile, or the first leaves, up toward the soil surface. That's the process called germination, and it's been demonstrated in the lab that when that's occurring, if water temperatures get real cold, some of the cells lose their elasticity. They get a little stiff, just like we do when we're cold. And if that happens, some of those cell walls can break and those kind of things, and it's more prone to infections from fungal organisms in the soil and those kind of things, and we can lose germination and lose emergence when that happens. Now, I think this week we're talking about some cold weather. Soil conditions, and right now, aren't too bad. We've been out working up some soil. It works up nicely. It seems to be planting nicely. I know it's going to turn cold here. Like I said, I think we can demonstrate some of those conditions in the lab. But if you put that seed in the ground now, soil temperatures are in the mid-50s. If it rains today, by the time it reaches that seed, it's actually going to be a little bit warmer than when it falls from the sky. So that's how I think those conditions are really hard to duplicate in the field. And to be able to say that if you plant corn today and it's raining cold tomorrow morning, you're going to have a problem. I don't know that that's true for all fields and all situations. I think no one's going to get all their corn planted between now and tomorrow anyway, but I think those that are trying it, I don't blame them. In fact, when we get off the phone, Jerry, I've got a couple of trials ready to plant, and I'm going to plant them, and I fully expect cooperation from the corn seedlings and the weather.
The other thing, I was visiting with a couple farmers, that some of the larger farmers that I know, they've been going because they have a lot of acres to get over, even though they have big equipment. I was talking to a couple smaller farmers, and they were saying, well, I can get all my corn planted in a couple days. So maybe I'm going to wait a little bit for that sweet spot. And that sounds kind of logical to me, too, unless now it starts raining for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or more.
I don't blame them for that either. I mean, if we talked about sweet corn, we've got some sweet corn here, and I said I don't know that I'd plant sweet corn today. It doesn't have quite the cold tolerance that our regular field corn hybrids do. So we're not going to plant some of the sweet corn that we may have otherwise planted. We just finished here a pretty comprehensive planting date trial, too. And I'd like to share a little bit of that, and I feel confident that we're in a better situation than we were 50 years ago when people started looking at corn planting dates. There's two things about early planted corn that put it in a better position. One is we have a short season. We know that frost is coming in the fall. Planting early puts you in a position to get the crop mature before frost. That remains unchanged. The other advantage early planted corn has is you run less of a risk of stressful conditions at pollination. Pollination is a very critical time for corn. Early planted corn usually pollinates late July, mid-July maybe. Later planted corn is trying to do that in August. Now, remember when we were kids, Jerry, almost every August, we never mowed our lawn.
Yeah.
Lawns turned brown. We always could count on things getting dry in August. Well, our rainfall pattern is such that we don't see that as much anymore. And I think later planted corn is in a better position to experience good conditions at pollination. My trial planting corn up through May 25th, we didn't take much of a yield penalty at all. So for those that say, I've only got 3 days of planting, and they don't want to do it today, I have no problem with that. For the guys that have a lot of corn, and they're only going to get maybe what they plant today, maybe 2 or 3% of their entire operation, I'm pretty confident that I think they'll be fine.
I know as I was driving home yesterday from the state FFA convention in St. Paul on campus, I didn't see one tractor out in the field doing anything. I think they probably got a little bit more rain. So parts of our listening area, the guys don't have much of an opportunity because soil conditions are still so wet. And I don't think at this date, being the 25th of April, I'd want to be mudding the crop in either.
No, I would not. If conditions aren't right, here's what I don't want to happen. I don't want to plant it in conditions that are maybe a little bit too wet, and then you experience 10 days of cold and saturated. I think if it turns cold, and there's almost no doubt it's going to turn cold. But if soils aren't saturated to the point that there's, water basically sitting on the surface, that's when corn really struggles, when it's cold and wet. I think if we can keep our rain levels down to the quarter-inch level where it isn't just basically sitting in cold water, I think we're going to be okay in that situation.
I know before now, well, even week and a half ago, I already saw some anhydrous rigs out in the field applying anhydrous ammonia. A lot of dry fertilizer's been spread.
There's a fair amount of activity going on, but like you say, I haven't seen a lot of whole hog really. Those days when you drive down the road and every mile you see an operation going, we haven't seen that yet. So part of that may be some of the conditions, like if you don't have adequate drainage. I think some of these fields still have a little bit of fairly deep moisture from last year's record precipitation. Some fields have pretty good pattern tile and probably have removed a lot of that. In those cases, you probably see some people planting.
I know I had to change gears because for a number of years I've gotten my anhydrous on in the fall, late fall with anhydrous and N-Serve. Well, last year it was so warm all fall till well into October into November. I just kept holding off, and all at once then it got wet, so my anhydrous didn't get on last fall. December I decided to go with urea, spread 100 pounds an acre of actual N over the top yesterday, and I'm going to go out this afternoon and work it in, unless it's raining, then I figure I'm fine. And then I'm going to come back for the last 20 or 30 pounds and side dress some liquid nitrogen.
That's probably not a bad idea. To put on quite a bit of your N pre-plant, that gives you the chance to kind of assess the crop at side dress time and know basically based on weather conditions. If it's been wet all of May, where is that 100 pounds that you put on early? Is it still there? Then you can make the call at side dress time as to how much you may need. And there's some good methods. I know the university has a nitrogen worksheet that you can fill out, and it is based on your source and timing and how much rain you've had, and makes a pretty good prescription for what you might need side dress.
I could have gotten a co-op. They spread the urea yesterday to impregnate my dual 2 magnum, but I was concerned about maybe getting it worked in too deep, so my plan is to plant it and then spray that over the top after planting.
I think that's a good plan. A lot of people that do put on some of those impregnated products for weed control, and the amount of mixing you need to do in the spring of the year to really get a nice uniform seed bed probably is too deep for those materials. They work best in the top quarter to a half inch of soil. That's where you really want them. When you're tilling the spring, it's probably mixing more like 3-4 inches deep. Some of that gets diluted, and I think we lose a little performance.
Did you catch that? I listened to you guys. I'm putting a pre-emergence on. Did you catch that?
Yeah, I think a lot of growers are catching that. I think that's really been, we've got a number of weed issues out there, and most people recognize that I can't rely on one mode of action to take care of it all. So we are really in tune to getting a good start on weed control and using some of these soil applied products and getting a help, knowing that we don't have a safety net of one mode of action that's going to save us post-emergence.
Repeat that again about your planting studies, that you've seen very little yield loss with corn planted up to May 25th. Do you want to repeat that again so my blood pressure can go down a little more?
That really was in response to the spring of 2013.
I'm trying to forget that year. Do you have to remind me?
No, here's what, in the spring of 2013, a lot of people were calling. That was the year we had, not far, like Owatonna, we had about a foot of snow here. Some places had like 18 inches of snow. Trees were down. Power lines were down.
On about May 2nd or 3rd that year.
It was the evening of May 2nd. I mean, it was, bottom line, it was the worst spring in recorded history, I think, for right here in south central Minnesota. And it got to be June. A lot of people hadn't got their corn in yet. And most people have a prevented planting or a crop revenue coverage clause in their crop insurance that would say if conditions are such that you can't plant corn, you will get a payment of this amount. And most people had that in mind, and they would call me and say, here's one thing I learned about farmers. They want to farm. Nobody called saying, boy, I hope my prevented planting will cover me so I don't have to plant a crop and I can just take my coverage. They really wanted to plant a crop, and we talked about what would I expect planting corn on June 10th. And we had done some work in the 1990s, early 1990s. We did some fairly comprehensive planting day work. And at that time, my bottom line was, I think we could expect about 100 bushel corn planting early to mid-June. Well, now corn yields have gone up, so all we really could do is extrapolate and say, translate that to modern hybrids. At that time, I said, we need some planting date work done because we don't have a good database for that.
Yeah, you did, but it was corn genetics from 20 years ago.
Yeah, it was, and corn's going up about 2.5 bushel per acre per year. So I knew that 1990 data really didn't apply. So I said, can we just move that up? Well, I did some planting date work in 2014, 15, and 16. Now, 14 was a short season, cool year, one that you wouldn't expect to get late planted corn doing very well, and I was pretty impressed with. The May 25th planting really worked out pretty well. We went out to June 10th and planted. Of course, that we did take quite a yield penalty for that. But my feeling on planting up through the middle of, even like May 25th, stay with your full season hybrids, stay the course of your original plan. I think we stand a very good chance of recognizing maybe not maximum yields, but very good yields up through the 25th of May. It's probably better to plant May 20th in good conditions than to plant April 20th in challenging wet conditions.
And the only catch is maybe you have a good crop going planted late like that. Well, I think you can probably bank that the moisture might be higher, so maybe you book a little extra propane for corn drying in the fall.
That is true. Take into account drying, and modern corn seems to dry a lot better than what we had 20, 30, 40 years ago. So even corn drying, soil or grain moisture in the fall of the year was not as bad as what you might think.
So what kind of yields did you see then as you went into early June? And this was a 3-year study then.
3-year study. Some of our best years planting corn into up to June 10th, we had some 180 bushel yields planting June 10th, and I was really impressed with that.
Wow.
My other thought was this is for right here in south central Minnesota, and I said the same thing in the early 1990s. I don't see a big advantage to going any earlier than like 95-day corn. A lot of people would say, do I need to, when I'm out there planting June 1st, do I need to drop to an 85-day? And I say no. I think about 95 is as early as we ever need to plant. Right up to, my cutoff is, June 15th, you'd forget about planting corn. But certainly up till the 1st of June, we've got some excellent opportunities to get a good crop.
It's nice to know we have that research data. Now, granted, we are a far cry from that. We are a far cry from what we saw in 2013. But as we come in the morning and look at the forecast for the next 4 or 5 days, it doesn't look good. Calendar's going to be flipping over to May 1st. And I think the biggest problem is we all still remember 2013 too well.
That is true, and most people are anxious to get things done. It's just it's human nature to, when you've got work to do, to take an opportunity and get it done. I think there's a few people doing that this morning. Looks like they're going to get a respite now for probably the 6 to 10 day outlook doesn't look very good, but we'll get the corn in. Hopefully, what I want is 2 weeks of wall-to-wall sunshine and dry weather. That's what I'd like to see.
We could get the corn in, the beans in, all those pre-emergence herbicides on, and then get a nice inch of rain.
That's what I'd like to see.
Not that farmers are hard to please when it comes to asking for the weather.
That's exactly what the doctor would prescribe.
We only have about 5 minutes left, Tom, but wanted to quickly mention the new technologies with the Extend and the Enlist and all of these. I assume you're going to be looking at those again this year. Boy, farmers that are going to be using these new technologies, they better be paying attention. Always read and follow label directions. And what I understand, the label is still changing.
Yes, it's a pretty new process. What it amounts to is we've now got the ability to use a family of chemistry that's certainly not new, but we've never had the opportunity to use it in soybeans before, and it's the dicamba, the growth regulator chemistries. We can now use those in soybeans, and it comes with quite a bit of challenges for the use. We've used dicamba a lot over the years, but we've never used it at the time we're going to be using it. We've never used it in soybeans. Things like drift, tank contamination are going to be real issues, and the label is very restrictive on when you can apply and what the wind has to be, and it's really going to be something that you're going to have to study the label very carefully. You can't just say, I've got dicamba beans, I can put on dicamba and go with it, because there's going to be a lot of restrictions, and it's going to take some education. Talk to your dealer, find out the do's and the don'ts, and the whys and the why nots, and I think we'll get along fairly well.
But on the other hand, Tom, if we don't and farmers aren't following the label and there are some issues, the Department of Agriculture could rescind it and take it off the market here in Minnesota. They have that power if we don't do it right.
That's why people want to pay attention and talk about it. Talk to people, talk to your dealers, talk to your agronomists, talk to anybody you can about how to get it done right, because you're right. If it turns out to be a huge problem across the landscape, the Department of Agriculture might just say this chemistry is not where we want to go, it's not worth the risks, and they might pull it off the market. So be careful. It's a fine mode of action of herbicides. Gives us some tools that we might want to use, and just make sure you use it correctly.
Some of us that aren't Roundup Ready babies can remember spraying a lot of 2,4-D. I was a kid. I was spraying Dad's corn with 2,4-D, but the corn was an inch or two tall. The beans probably weren't planted yet, or certainly they weren't up. Drift wasn't quite as much of an issue as when we'll be using the dicamba or the 2,4-D now.
Yeah, there's going to be soybeans all over the landscape. It's going to be more like mid-June when we're talking about using this. Temperature inversions, that's when products can get up and volatilize and move. That's when you see ground fog. Those conditions exist a lot more in mid-June than they do in May when we were putting dicamba on corn. So there's a lot of things to pay attention to. What it amounts to is study hard and read all the directions you can, get it done right.
Only about a minute and a half left, Tom. Was there something we should have gone over quickly that we haven't? Of course, it's not like I can't get a hold of you and find out.
You sure can. No, I think we're getting a little start on corn planting. I think We're going to be probably in slow motion here, the way the forecast looks. I just looked at the 6 to 10 day outlook. It's cooler than normal, leaning towards above normal precipitation. I just hope we don't get deluged with those soaking rains that really take a long time to drain off. We can handle these little quarter inchers where at least you've got some air in the soil yet. Corn seedlings can take that when they're in the soil, and they've got, even though it's cold, if it's not soaking wet, I think we can overcome those situations and get a good stand.
And that's what the problem in 2013, we were getting multiple inches, whereas this year we'd get a tenth or a quarter.
Yes, we've managed to miss a lot of those big 1 and 2 inch rains, and that's something we can deal with. If we get 15 hundredths one night, it's basically get a couple hours of sunshine and we're back at it again. So sunshine is what I'd like to see.
Thanks, Tom. Get out and get those plots planted now.
All right. Thank you, Jerry.
Tom Hoverstad, who's a scientist at the Southern Research and Outreach Center at Waseca. Here's news from ABC.
From ABC News.